Hi ladies, Miss Robertson here. First of all, I want to thank you for all of your hard work. Today we are going to be learning about the moon part 2. So let's get started. Please pull up, if you have not already, your moon part 2 worksheet. Here are the questions that you will be looking at today. Now I just want to point out, when you get to the second question, you're going to have to think about what happened and decide instances there was a problem, and that would go in this box. The outcome if they had had a fixed mindset, and then here the actions and outcomes because they had the growth mindset. So this will be a little bit of thinking. All right, let's first talk about the very first mission that made it to Mars. You might have recalled this from our homework the other night.
But on July 20th, 1969, humans were able to close that distance with the American spaceflight mission Apollo 11.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But just how did they go about getting somebody to Mars, and what was the technology like then? Let's see.
In other news, 1960s computers were slowly integrating card RAM, virtual memory, and disk storage drives that could store up to 1 megabyte of information. And just as a small reference, this video is encoded at 14 megabytes a second. Even though this technology would be considered less powerful than a modern calculator, it made it possible for man to land on the moon. A special computer known as the Apollo Guidance Computer was instrumental in the Apollo program. It was first used in 1966, but its performance was comparable to early first-generation home computers from the 70s, like the Apple II.
Wow, can you imagine that something that old could get us to the moon? But we did get to the moon. Here is a little bit more about what happened.
On May 25, 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to land someone on the moon before the end of the decade. America had barely just started sending people to space at all. But just 8 years later, and 47 years ago today, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon on the Apollo 11 mission. They were the first humans to ever set foot on another world. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969 at 9:32 a.m. local time from, appropriately enough, Cape Kennedy, Florida. Armstrong, Aldrin, and a third astronaut, Michael Collins, were on board. To get all the way to the moon, they were perched in a small capsule atop the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket in history. Fully loaded with fuel, the Saturn V was over 100 meters tall and weighed almost 3 million kilograms. That's 15 times as much as a blue whale. The rocket worked in 3 stages. The first stage burned 800,000 liters of a fuel called RP-1, a type of kerosene that's used in rockets. It ran out of the RP-1 in the upper atmosphere, where the first stage detached and fell into the Atlantic Ocean below. This made way for a second stage that burned through 1 million liters of liquid hydrogen. The second stage ran out of fuel at the edge of space, which is where the third and final stage took over, burning even more liquid hydrogen. It kept burning until the ship was high enough and going fast enough to orbit the Earth. Then the engines were turned off, but they still had some fuel left to burn. After a couple of hours, the crew aimed at the moon and turned the rockets back on. 2 days later, they became the third crew in history to orbit the moon, and their mission was still just beginning. Armstrong and Aldrin crawled into the lunar module and started drifting down towards the surface, while Michael Collins stayed in lunar orbit. Up to this point, things had gone pretty smoothly. The rockets fired like they were supposed to, and Apollo 11 seemed to be following the path that NASA scientists had mapped out. But no one had tried to land on the lunar surface before, and that's when they started to run into some problems. For one thing, the lunar module's computers almost fried themselves. But the computer was also aiming the ship at rocks. They were supposed to land in the middle of the Sea of Tranquility, which is a big, flat basin on the moon's surface. But early in the descent, Armstrong and Aldrin noticed that they were passing landmarks about 3 seconds earlier than they were supposed to. 3 seconds might not sound like that big of a deal, but it meant that they were going to land a few kilometers away from where they'd originally planned. And as they got closer, Armstrong noticed that they were headed right for a field of boulders. If they hit one of those boulders, that would be the end of the mission, and maybe even their lives. With only about 30 seconds worth of fuel left to spare, Armstrong switched control of the craft over to a semi-manual mode and piloted it to safety. And that was it. The first humans in history had landed on the moon. According to the official schedule, they were supposed to follow the landing with a few hours of rest before getting ready to open the door. But they were a little too excited to sleep. I mean, who wouldn't be? They were on the moon. So the schedule was switched around a bit, and they immediately started preparing to go outside. And so, on July 20th, 1969, at 10:56 p.m. on the east coast of the United States, an estimated 600 million people worldwide, a fifth of the world's population at the time, watched Neil Armstrong become the first person to set foot on the moon, with Buzz Aldrin following closely behind him. Little known to most of that immense audience, though, NASA wasn't positive that the astronauts would get back off the moon. If it took more fuel than planned, or if something went wrong or broke on the way up, they would be stranded there, and there was no rescue plan. This was a likely enough possibility that speechwriter William Safire was asked to write a speech for then-President Richard Nixon to read in case the worst happened. And something did break while they were on the moon's surface. When he was getting back into the cramped lunar module, Aldrin accidentally broke a knob off a circuit breaker that was responsible for arming the main engine. Luckily, he and Armstrong realized that they could fix the problem by sticking a felt-tipped pen where the knob went. They safely rejoined Michael Collins in orbit and headed home. 8 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds after leaving Earth, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. At the time, scientists didn't actually know if there was any life on the moon, so the entire crew was quarantined for almost a month, just in case they brought back anything dangerous. Then, finally, they were released and went back to living life like the rest of us, if the rest of us were huge international celebrities. Thanks.
Whoa, that sounded like a crazy ride. Please make sure that you have answered the first 2 questions. Pause the video if you have not to do so now. Okay, so most people say, yay, we landed on the moon, and then we move on from there. But I wanted you to know a little bit more about other missions that happened. This will really give you the feel of what they did at the moon. So as you know, that first mission was Apollo 11. So we're going to start now with Apollo 12.
I can assure you that millions here in the United States and around the world were watching, and I am just tremendously proud, personally, and speaking also representing the American people, of what you've done.
Apollo 12 was the second successful moon landing. It was also the first mission to have the remote possibility of interplanetary contamination. Long story short, NASA sent over a surveyor module to extract lunar soil and take pictures 2 years before the Apollo 12 mission. The crew was tasked with bringing back the soil samples and camera from the moon. It is widely claimed that Streptococcus mitis bacteria accidentally contaminated the camera equipment of the surveyor before launch. When the Apollo 12 crew brought the camera back, the bacteria was discovered, still alive. As unbelievable as it sounds, this tiny little organism managed to survive the extremely harsh lunar environment for 2.5 years. Oh, the crew also carried the first color TV camera to the moon, but accidentally destroyed it when it was pointed towards the sun.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a beep audible.
Apart from being a dramatic story of extreme bravery, skill, and fortune, the Apollo 13 crew is also credited as the farthest humans have ever traveled from Earth, at an astounding 248,655 miles. Apollo 14, Apollo 15, Apollo 16 were all successful missions. Notably at the time, Apollo 15 was regarded as the most successful manned flight ever achieved.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May the month. That's right. May is the year of the month. When, much to my surprise, a pair of lovely eyes.
And finally, we have arrived to a distinct moment in human history, the Apollo 17 mission. The crew, made up of Commander Eugene Cernan, Command Module Pilot Ronald Evans, and Lunar Module Pilot Harrison Schmitt, broke several records, including longest time in lunar orbit, longest moon landing, largest lunar sample, and longest total moonwalks. Prepared with a lunar roving vehicle, Cernan and Schmitt spent a little over 3 days on the moon's surface, while Evans patiently awaited in the command module orbiting the moon. Since it was considered as the last mission of the Apollo program, there was a lot of discussion on where exactly the lunar module should land and what kind of information they should bring back. Considering the gravity of the situation, Apollo 17 was the first flight to have a geologist on it. The crew of 3 were not the only living organisms in that module. Apollo 17 also performed a biological cosmic ray experiment which employed 5 highly educated and specifically trained mice. Nicknamed by the crew as Fee, Fi, Fo, Fum, and Fooey, 4 of the 5 mice made it safely back to Earth, with no signs of lasting cosmic ray radiation. The crew was also responsible for one of the most famous pictures known as the Blue Marble Photo, taken from 18,000 miles away as they were headed to the moon. During the 3-day lunar landing, Cernan and Schmitt managed to set a few more records. They covered more than 22 miles in 1 day. They collected 75 pounds of samples, and Cernan set the official lunar speed record, going at a maximum speed of 11.2 miles per hour in the lunar rover. At the end of the 3rd spacewalk, it was time for Schmitt and Cernan to head back to the control module up above.
Bob, this is Gene, and I'm on the surface. And as I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just let what I believe history will record that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon in Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
And with that statement, Eugene Cernan was the last man on the moon. Check out the featured
And that was the last Apollo mission. So you should now be able to go ahead and answer the 3rd and final question on your worksheet. We'll talk about it more in class. Have a good afternoon, ladies.